External respiration has 4 steps. The first step is ventilation. Ventilation is the ability to move air in and out of the lungs. We accomplish ventilation by using pressure gradients. Pressure moves from areas of high pressure to low pressure. Pressure can be changed by changing the volume in which the air molecules are held. Below you see all the containers have 10 air molecules. The pressure exerted by these 10 air molecules is related to the size of the container in which they're held. Pressure is exerted when an air molecule randomly makes contact with the container. By changing the size of the container, we can change the pressure that these air molecules exert. The air pressure in container A is greater than the air pressure in container B or C because it has the smallest volume. Likewise, the pressure in container C is less than the pressure in container A and B because it has a higher volume. If we connected all of these chambers, we would see a gradual movement of molecules from container A into container B and then into container C. If we interconnected all of the chambers, we would see that few molecules from chamber C would move towards chamber B, and few molecules from chamber B would move towards chamber A. However, because the pressure in chamber A is the highest, it is going to flow towards chamber B and then towards chamber C. As the molecules move from high pressure to low pressure, they eventually will reach equilibrium where all molecules are equally spaced out between the 3 containers. This is similar to how our lungs will function. Typically, atmospheric pressure is around 760 millimeters of mercury. If atmospheric pressure was 760 millimeters of mercury, and in our lungs pressure was 760 millimeters of mercury, no air would be exchanged. This occurs in between inspiration and expiration. If we were able to increase the volume of the lungs, we would see a pressure drop within the lungs. This slight pressure drop of only 1 millimeter of mercury would make the lung pressure less than atmospheric pressure, and air would move from the environment into our lungs. Being able to move air into the lungs is only half of the equation. Because our blood is constantly getting refreshed by needing to pick up more oxygen and drop off more carbon dioxide, we need to be able to move air back out of the lungs. This would be accomplished by being able to decrease the volume of the lungs, which would result in an increase in pressure. And if we get an increase of pressure that makes lung pressure greater than atmospheric pressure, we would see air molecules move out of the lungs back into the environment. Inspiration and expiration is accomplished by changing the volume of the lungs. If atmospheric pressure becomes greater than lung pressure, inspiration will occur. Air will move into the lungs. This is accomplished by increasing the volume of the lungs, which results in a decrease in pressure. Expiration occurs when atmospheric pressure becomes lower than lung pressure. This will move air from the lungs into the environment. This is accomplished by decreasing the volume of the lungs. Airflow, similar to blood flow, is equal to a change in pressure over resistance. In normal conditions, the 1 millimeter of mercury change we used in the prior examples is sufficient for adequate airflow. This is because the resistance within the bronchi, the bronchioles, alveoli, trachea, pharynx, and larynx is very low. Our lungs consist of two lobes, one found in the left thoracic cavity and one on the right side of the thoracic cavity. In order to change the volume of the lungs have to be adhered to a fixture of our thoracic wall. This is accomplished by the pleural cavity. The pleural cavity fully engulfs the lungs and is filled with an interpleural fluid. The pleural cavity is then securely attached to the thoracic wall. Our thoracic wall is connected to skeletal muscle. If we are able to increase our thoracic wall, we would exert a force on the pleural cavity, which exerts a force on the lungs, resulting in an increase in volume. Because the thoracic wall, pleural cavity, and lungs are securely connected, what volume changes are exerted in the thoracic wall will be transferred to the pleural cavity and the lungs. If we see an increase in volume in the thoracic wall, we will see the pleural cavity be pulled outward, which will then expand the lung volume because the three are interconnected. Likewise, if we see a compression on the thoracic wall, we will see a pushing inward force on the pleural cavity and a pushing inward force on the lungs, resulting in a decrease in volume. The pleural cavity is not directly connected to the lungs or atmospheric pressure. It is a closed capsule containing interpleural fluid. This pleural fluid helps decrease friction between surfaces as the thoracic wall expands and contracts. The pleural cavity has a pressure of about 756 millimeters of mercury. This is lower than the pressure in the lungs. The lungs' pressure of 760 millimeters of mercury exerts an outward force and keeps the lungs expanded. The pleural cavity exerts an inward force on the lungs. However, since the 756 millimeters of mercury is less than the 760 millimeters of mercury, the outward force produced which allows the lungs to continue to expand. The lungs are composed of a high concentration of elastin fibers. These elastin fibers want to recoil as the lungs expand due to the increase of volume. The consequence of losing this transmural pressure gradient is evident when we see someone who experiences a fractured rib that punctures the lung. In this situation, atmospheric pressure is going to flow down its pressure gradient and move into the pleural cavity. As this happens, pleural cavity pressure will raise from 756 to 760. This will exert a greater force on the lungs, causing the pressure gradient to equalize. This increased inward force on the lungs, along with the elastic property of the lungs, will cause the lung to recoil and deflate. Because the outward pushing force of this 4 millimeter of mercury pressure difference is lost, the elastin becomes the dominant force acting upon the lungs. This elastin is going to pull the lungs inward, causing the lungs to collapse, and air will no longer be able to move in and out of that lung. Lung volume is also increased by inspiratory muscle contraction. The main inspiratory muscles are the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles. The diaphragm is positioned in between the thoracic and the abdominal cavity. It is securely connected to the pleural cavity. Surrounding the lungs are the ribs and the sternum. Attached to the ribs in the sternum are the intercostal muscles. When the diaphragm contracts, it pulls the thoracic cavity down into the abdominal cavity. This expands the vertical distance of the thoracic cavity. When the external intercostal muscles contract, they exert an up and outward force on the thoracic cavity. This increases the width of the thoracic cavity. Because the thoracic cavity is connected to the pleural cavity, which is connected to the lungs, any expansion in the thoracic cavity is passed on or transmitted to the lungs. So an increase in thoracic cavity due to the contraction of the intercostal muscles and the diaphragm results in an increase in volume of the lungs and a decrease in pressure within the lungs. This causes air from the environment to rush into the lungs to equalize the pressure gradient. In order to decrease the volume of the lungs, we need to decrease the volume of the thoracic cavity. This is accomplished by the elastic recoil of the lungs, the relaxation of the inspiratory muscles, which is a passive process, and can be enhanced by the activation of forced expiratory muscles. The forced expiratory muscles are the abdominals and the internal intercostal muscles. The abdominal muscle, when contracted, will exert an upward and inward force on the lungs, and the internal intercostal muscles will also exert a downward force upon the lungs. When the forced expiratory muscles are activated, we get an increased force upon the lungs, resulting in an even greater decrease in volume. We can measure the amount of air moving in and out of our lungs through spirometry. A spiromegram is a graph showing the measurement of airflow moving in and out of the lungs. At rest, we are only using about half the volume of our lungs. When we are using a normal breathing pattern, we only move about 0.5 liters of air in and out of our lungs with every breath. This breathing is a slow, controlled manner where we are not fully filling up or exhaling the air in our lungs. Normal breathing is called our tidal volume. Tidal volume is usually 0.5 liters of air with every breath. If you try to fully inspire and completely fill up your lungs, the amount of inspiration above your tidal volume is called your inspiratory reserve volume. This is the reserve space in your lungs that can be filled with air if necessary. The sum of your tidal volume plus your inspiratory reserve volume is called your inspiratory capacity. If you try to fully expire all the air in your lungs beyond that of your tidal volume, this volume is called your expiratory reserve volume. This expiratory reserve volume is usually about an additional 1 liter of air that you can push out of your lungs forcefully. In order to push this additional 1 liter of air out, you would need to use those accessory expiratory muscles of the abdominals and the internal intercostal muscles. You will notice, even after the most forceful expiratory contraction, you cannot fully empty your lungs. The volume of air that you are unable to expel from your lungs is called your residual reserve volume. This is approximately 1.2 liters of air. The purpose of the residual reserve volume is to ensure that the alveoli never collapse due to a lack of pressure within the lungs. It also ensures that all blood passing through the pulmonary circulation is able to exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide with the alveoli. If we were able to fully empty our lungs, the blood passing through our lungs during expiration would be unable to diffuse between the air and the blood. Having a residual reserve volume allows the alveolar sacs to remain open due to the increased pressure of the air compared to the pleural cavity, and allows for all blood passing through the lungs at all times to participate in exchange. Vital capacity is the volume of air that we are able to maximally inhale and exhale. This includes everything except for our residual reserve. Total lung capacity is all of the volumes combined. It includes the total amount of air that can be in the lungs at any given time. The spirogram is helpful to practitioners because it can help detect where issues in respiration occur. If a person is unable to fully exhale or has a decrease in expiratory reserve, we might assume that either the elasticity of the lungs is failing or their additional expiratory muscles are not fully functioning. If someone is having trouble inspiring, we might see a decrease in slope as they try to inhale, meaning it takes longer for the air to move from the environment into their lungs. A final measure that practitioners will use is your forced expiratory volume in 1 second. This shows how much air you can move out of your lungs in 1 second and can give a good indication of the compliance and the elasticity of your lungs, both on the amount of volume you can move into your lungs and then forcefully expire out of your lungs. Anatomical dead space is the area in which gas exchange cannot occur. Before reaching the point of gas exchange in the alveoli, the air has to move through the pharynx, larynx, tracheae, bronchi, and bronchioli. Air in these spaces cannot be exchanged. However, they must be filled with air before they are able to reach the alveoli. The approximate volume of the anatomical dead space is about 150 milliliters in an average adult. This anatomical dead space directly affects the amount of air that can be exchanged. The average tidal volume of an adult is 500 milliliters of air. As this 500 milliliters of air is brought in to the lungs during inspiration, we must take into account the amount of anatomical dead space. The air reaching the alveoli is equal to the tidal volume minus the volume of the anatomical dead space, which is about 500 milliliters minus 150 milliliters, resulting in only 350 milliliters reaching the alveoli. Only 350 milliliters of air are actually available for gas exchange. The 150 milliliters that fill the anatomical dead space is inexchangeable. The anatomical dead space also affects the volume of air that is expired back into the environment. Once again, the amount of air expired is equal to the tidal volume minus the anatomical dead space. All of the air cannot be forcefully expired from the anatomical dead space. These passageways must remain filled during expiration. When we expire, the 150 milliliters of air within the anatomical dead space will be expired, along with 200 milliliters of the air within the alveoli. This is because 150 milliliters of air from the alveoli must remain in the anatomical dead space. Because of the anatomical dead space within an individual, it is important to distinguish between pulmonary ventilation and alveolar ventilation. Pulmonary ventilation is the amount of air moved in and out of the lungs per minute. This is determined by taking the respiratory rate, the number of breaths you have per minute, times the tidal volume of each breath. During normal breathing, we have an average respiratory rate of 12 breaths per minute and an average tidal volume 500 milliliters per minute. This means we move about 6 liters of air in and out of the lungs per minute. However, because of the anatomical dead space, not all of that 6,000 milliliters are available for gas exchange. The amount of air available for gas exchange is known as the alveolar ventilation. Again, this is the amount of air moved in and out of the alveoli per minute. Again, we have a respiratory rate of 12 breaths per minute, and then we must take the anatomical dead space out of the tidal volume because this is the amount of air that is actually available for exchange that reaches the alveoli. If we take the 500 milliliter tidal volume from the above example and subtract out the anatomical dead space of 150 milliliters, we see that only about 4,200 milliliters are actually available for exchange of that pulmonary ventilation. During normal activity, this is not an issue. However, we are able to consciously change our respiratory rate to meet our metabolic demands. A key example of this is during exercise. We see both an increase in respiratory rate and an increase in tidal volume. This is beneficial to us because we are able to increase the amount of air we move in and out of our lungs per minute. This helps provide the blood an increased ability to move oxygen into the bloodstream and remove carbon dioxide. When someone is hyperventilating, they experience an increase in respiratory rate and a decrease in tidal volume. It is not uncommon for respiratory rates to reach 40 breaths per minute and tidal volume to decrease to 150 milliliters. If we were only looking at pulmonary ventilation, we would see that the amount of air moved in and out of the lungs per minute is no different than during normal breathing. However, this is where the distinction between pulmonary ventilation and alveolar ventilation becomes evident. Because we have to subtract the anatomical dead space of 150 milliliters, we are only filling and emptying the anatomical dead space. This means that 0 milliliters of air actually reach the alveolar. If an individual is hyperventilating and moving no air in and out of the alveoli, in a matter of minutes, they should pass out in order to reestablish normal breathing patterns. Because alveolar ventilation is the amount of air that we can actually use, it's important to look at how small changes in respiratory rate and tidal volume can make a large difference in how we get our gas exchange needs met. If we look at deep breathing compared to fast breathing, we can see how alveolar ventilation can change based on the method that is employed by the individual. If we increase tidal volume by 20% in the case of deep breathing, tidal volume would increase from 500 milliliters to 600 milliliters. If we increase respiratory rate by 20%, as in the fast breathing example, we would increase respiratory rate to 14.4 breaths per minute and maintain the 500 milliliters of tidal volume. In both situations, we would see a pulmonary ventilation of 7,200 milliliters. Let's see what happens when we look at alveolar ventilation. Simply by increasing tidal volume by 20%, we are able to exchange 5.4 milliliters of air during deep breathing. Compared to fast breathing, where we increased respiratory rate again by 20%, we see that alveolar ventilation decreased compared to deep breathing ventilation to 5,040 milliliters. This means that deep breathing resulted in a positive 6.6% increase in exchangeable air to the individual. This is why during high metabolic demand activities, we see an increase in respiratory rate, but we see a significantly larger increase in tidal volume changes. The second step of external respiration is the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the alveoli and the pulmonary capillaries. Similar to the cardiovascular tree, diffusion of gases cannot occur in all places of the respiratory tree. The air must make it through the nasal pathway or the mouth, through the pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchus, bronchioli, all the way to the alveoli before exchange can occur. Exchange occurs in the alveolar sacs between capillaries and the alveoli. Alveolar sacs are ideal for diffusion to occur because they have an increase in surface area and a decrease in distance between the capillaries and the alveolar sacs. The alveolar sacs consist of a single flattened layer of type 1 alveolar cells. These are extremely thin and situated close to pulmonary capillaries. This decrease in distance and thinness of both the capillaries and the alveolar type 1 cells decrease distance to maximize diffusion, speed, and ability. The alveoli have tremendous surface area. Alveolar sacs are clustered together in thin-walled inflatable grape-like sacs at the terminal branches of the conducting airways. Each alveolus is surrounded by a network of pulmonary capillaries that are also only one cell thick. There is an interstitial fluid between the alveolar sacs and the capillaries, but it is an incredibly thin barrier. The alveolar air-blood surface presents a great surface area for exchange. If we were able to stretch out all the alveolar sacs, we would have an area that would cover close to that of a tennis court. This tremendous surface area and small distance for diffusion makes the alveoli ideally suited for diffusion of gases. Within the alveolar is a thin fluid layer that lines each alveolus. This film liquid creates surface tension. The surface tension has a twofold effect. The liquid layer resists any force that increases surface area, meaning it opposes expansion of the alveoli because the water molecules oppose being pulled apart. The greater the surface area, the less recoil or compliance the lungs have. The second effect of the liquid surface area is it tends to shrink as small as possible because the water molecules are attracted together and cause the alveolar to pull shut. This reduces the alveolar size, squeezing in on the air inside. The surface tension, allowed with the elastin properties of the lungs, allow the lungs to recoil back to their pre-inspiratory size when the body is trying to exhale. However, we do not want the alveoli to completely shut. This would prevent gas exchange from occurring between the alveoli and the capillaries. This is countered by pulmonary surfactant produced by the type 2 alveolar cells. This lowers surface tension because the cohesive force between the water molecule and the pulmonary surfactant is very low. By lowering the surface tension, the pulmonary surfactant increases pulmonary compliance, allowing it to inflate and increase lung volume size, and reduces the lung's tendency to recoil, so the alveolar do not completely shut or collapse. Premature born babies often do not have the ability to create surfactant. This causes respiratory distress syndrome because the babies have to work incredibly hard to fill the alveolar sacs with air due to the force of the surface tension. This causes the inspiratory muscles to have to work many times greater than that of a baby who is able to produce surfactant.